Welcome to today's book talk sponsored by UCLA Gender Studies, UCLA Center for the Study of Women, and the Consortium of Palestine Studies at UCLA. And I'm so happy and excited to host today Jennifer Lynn Kelly, an Associate Professor of Feminist Studies and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at University of California, Santa Cruz. She has received her PhD in American Studies with a portfolio in Women and Gender Studies from University of Texas at Austin, her master's degree in Interdisciplinary Humanities from New York University, and her BA in Feminist Studies and Literature from University of California, Santa Cruz. And her research broadly engages questions of settler colonialism, U.S. empire, and the fraud politics of both tourism and solidarity. Her first book is what she will be giving a talk today is called Invited to Witness, Solidarity Tourism Across Occupied Palestine, that came out from Duke University Press in 2023. And it is a multi-sided ethnography interdisciplinary study of solidarity tourism in Palestine that draws upon ethnographic as well as archival research. And in this project, Dr. Kelly analyzes the ways in which solidarity tourism has emerged in Palestine as an organizing strategy that is both embedded in and working against histories of sustained displacement. And this work couldn't be more timely and important as today, in so many different ways, solidarity with Palestine is so important, and we have so much to learn from this book about politics of solidarity in a nuanced way and think about its contradictions in a transnational context marked by colonialism, imperialism, militarism, and war, and genocidal violence in Palestine that's ongoing as we speak. So before I pass the mic to Dr. Kelly, I just want to let everyone know that at the end of her talk, which will be about 45 minutes long, we will take questions from the audience. So please hold on to your questions and you're welcome to type them in the Q&A. And Dr. Kelly will take them at the end. Dr. Kelly.
Thank you so much. Yeah, feel free to write your questions and I'll sort of bank them and answer them at the end. Thank you so much to all of you for being here, to Zeynep Korkman to your Transnational Feminisms class, to the Gender Studies Department, the Center for the Study of Women and the Palestine Studies Consortium for co-sponsoring the talk and inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be here and talk with you about my book and what we're witnessing in Gaza, and to really thank you for engaging these important questions about what solidarity actually means as we are all differentially witnessing a genocide. So I so appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to talk more about the research and welcome all of your sort of questions. And I know it's a grad seminar as well, so I'm always happy to talk about how the research unfolds and how we do this work as the sort of ground shifts underneath us. So I'm going to begin and end my talk by detailing what I think is incumbent on us as witnesses to a genocide. I will talk about the genocide in Gaza, connect it to the 6th chapter of my book, which is a chapter on virtual tours in Gaza. In between the military incursions, the multiple military incursions between 2007 and 2015 is how that chapter unfolds. And the way that Palestinian youth in Gaza, many of whom are now statistically likely to be displaced, missing, or murdered, have imagined their freedom. And then I'll end by providing resources for what to do with this knowledge. So I'll start just by saying that I've been doing teach-ins now for a year that are sort of oriented to this question of witnessing during Israeli state genocidal violence. And every time I speak, the number rises, of course, right? So Israel has now murdered over 186,000 Palestinians in the past 13 months, 186,000 mothers, daughters, sons, uncles, aunts, fathers, grandfathers, infants, neighbors, everyone, healthcare workers, journalists, patients. This carnage for all of us animates our everyday. It animates our every day as we move through sleeping and eating and remembering to drink water and dressing our babies and teaching our classes and going to work and going to protests and calling our representatives and writing our letters, drafting our statements, and planning our actions. We are all witnesses to this genocide in really radically uneven ways. So Palestinians in exile are forced to witness this genocide and not only witness their people sacrificed once again for Israel's expansionist vision, but also witness the screams in the streets that are just routinely ignored by political leaders. The indifference also of those whose lives have somehow continued uninterrupted, right? And the really depraved bloodlust of so many political leaders who want nothing more than more war. My other work is on US Christian Zionism, right? Which is at the crux of so much of this bloodlust for more war in Palestine. Journalists on the ground in Gaza, as you know, I'm sure, have laid down their vests since months into this genocide, right? To some in order to actually live through these layered massacres, and some to protest bearing witness to a world that refuses to act. In the words of Motas Azaiza in a desperate cry before he left Gaza, I don't even have my my slideshow, just a second. So in his words before he left, he wrote, "You are all useless, without shame, watching us be killed one by one." He demands that we ask ourselves what is incumbent on all of us as witnesses to a genocide. My first book is about this figure of the witness in Palestine. So Invited to Witness, Solidarity Tourism Across Occupied Palestine is a book about the practice since the First Intifada of bringing international tourists to Palestine to witness the effects of Israeli state violence and work toward Palestinian liberation. The reason solidarity tourism exists as a practice is because Palestinians are not treated as reliable narrators of their own condition, requiring international presence to corroborate their analyses of Israeli occupation. Despite the volumes of literature Palestinians have produced on their own condition, tourists still need to, quote, see it to believe it. Tourists still travel to Palestine in search of evidence when, in the words of one tour guide to a tourist in my research, look around you, there is evidence everywhere. This phenomenon treats witnessing as an alibi for research, with tourists and delegates positioning their own witnessing over the volumes of literature Palestinians have produced on their own condition. We have witnessed a genocide live streamed on Instagram for over a year. Every day, we are witnessing Israel on a murderous campaign that extends a long state practice of wanting Palestinian land without Palestinians on it, rain terror on Palestinians, murdering hundreds of thousands of people, 40% of them children in Gaza, with the most murdered age range being between 5 and 9. Flattening neighborhoods, deleting entire families from the civil registry, relentlessly bombing hospitals and universities and bakeries, sniping Palestinians waiting in line or combing the beach for food in attempts to save each other, burning people alive, kidnapping hospital workers, starving people out of their homes and lands, filling mass graves, all while arming settlers in the West Bank, where they have also murdered hundreds of Palestinians. The US is funding it all at the rate of $3.8 billion per year and always sending more, with this year totaling $17.9 billion since October 23. 68% of the weapons killing Palestinians are manufactured in the US. And still, while we are witnessing these deaths live streams, Palestinians are not treated as reliable narrators. They have been accused of fabricating the numbers of their dead, of bombing their own hospitals, of killing each other by stampede, when they have been shot by Israeli soldiers while waiting in line for food. And as they wrote the names of their babies on their bodies, so they were identified if they were bombed overnight, they have been accused, as we know, of using their babies as shields. What would it mean then in this moment, in all moments, to believe Palestinians when they speak? What would it mean if Palestinian warnings based on generational experiential knowledge of Israeli state violence were heeded? If when Palestinians said this is not about Hamas, this is about land, they were believed before Israel was unabashedly ethnically cleansing the north of Gaza, publicly refusing to allow Palestinians to return to their homes, while settler spectators are touring Gaza from the sea, laying claim to their new homes with an ocean view. The first ask of the witness to a genocide, then, is the work of believing Palestinians when they speak. This, I argue, is the work of reading. It's the work of anchoring ourselves in Palestinian studies, the work of a lifelong commitment to learning from Palestine, taking in the scholarship and literature produced out of Palestine as a practice. During one of the last bombing campaigns on Gaza in May 21, Scholars for Palestinian Freedom drafted a public statement to meaningfully engage, a public commitment to meaningfully engage Palestinian scholarship in our classroom, in our research, and in our institutions. That public letter, like many that have circulated for the past year, underscores, one, pressuring our academic institutions to respect the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel until it complies with international law. Two, naming and resisting complicity and partnership with military, academic, and legal institutions that entrench Israel's policies. And here is where so many of the encampments, which we can talk more about, have put into practice what Scholars for Palestinian Freedom called for in 21. Supporting student activism on campus, holding our universities accountable for violations of academic freedom, and substantively engaging Palestinian scholarship on Palestine in our syllabi, in our research, in our organizing, including Palestinian expertise on Palestine. So that is turning to Palestinian studies to understand what we are witnessing. In the spirit of really grounding ourselves in Palestinian studies, then, I want to turn to some context. Gaza is a sacred place. It is, after Jericho, considered the second oldest city in the world. It has historically been famous for its food, its culture, its textiles. It has a place that is nourished by the sea. 1948 saw the violent establishment of the State of Israel. Zionist paramilitary groups trained by the British attacked and depopulated 530 Palestinian villages alongside myriad city centers, exiling their inhabitants to refugee camps across Palestine, as well as elsewhere in the region, of course, like Jordan and Lebanon. Israeli state formation drove 750,000 Palestinians from their homes, with refugees believing they would return after the war, carrying their keys with them. 70,000 of those Palestinian refugees fled to Gaza. With Israel's takeover of even more land in 1967, including East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Sinai, the Golan Heights, and it also occupied Gaza, whose population then was 394,000, over 60% refugees from prior Israeli state violence and displacement. So in this way, the population of Gaza is and has been majority refugee already. Today, 17-year-olds in Gaza have lived their entire lives under Israeli siege, a blockade that restricts everything from calories to construction supplies, in addition to complete restriction on movement. They are 5 wars old. This is what my chapter on Gaza is about. My chapter on Gaza details Palestinian youth in Gaza's visions for a free Gaza and a free Palestine, what tourism could look like if they had control over their movement and their borders. The larger book deals with solidarity tours across Palestine. The solidarity tours I analyze range from day trips to the West Bank, cities and villages in the West Bank, to bus tours through East Jerusalem, to walking tours in villages and city centers inside Israel that were once or are still Palestinian. And drawing from participant observation on those tours, interviews with guides, organizers, and tourists, archival research on the report back genre, and analyses of virtual tours, I talk about what happens when tourism understands itself as solidarity and when solidarity functions through modalities of tourism. Solidarity tour guides' goals are multiple. By staging tourist encounters with everyday Palestinian life, organizers seek to challenge Israeli state-sanctioned narratives and offer tourist Palestinian accounts of Israeli state violence and settler colonialism. They also employ tourism to help Palestinian shop owners and farmers stay on land that is under constant threat of expropriation. They also invite tourists to witness and also invite them to go home and do their work from there, where their complicity is most entrenched and their advocacy most needed. And they work to confront the racialized asymmetries that arise in an industry that necessarily privileges tourist accounts of what they witness in Palestine over Palestinian narratives of their own displacement, where tourists travel to Palestine to, quote, see for themselves what Palestinians have long detailed in the historical record. So I show how in their daily labor, Palestinian tour organizers and guides who are under the constraint of settler colonial military occupation and in a context where they don't control their borders, wrest both the capacity to invite and, in Edward Said's words, the permission to narrate from Israeli control. I also detail the ambivalences and asymmetries that take shape in solidarity tourism's orbit, charting the conditions that have led Palestinians to make their case to the international community through solidarity tourism in the first place. So the book functions as a history of the colonial present that asks why Palestinian organizers have turned to tourism as an organizing strategy and an income-generating business, despite its fraught asymmetries, fully aware of its fraught asymmetries, and how guides and tourists, albeit radically unevenly, attempt to craft this anti-colonial movement outside of a strictly witnessed/witness relationship, and despite the epistemic violence or the violence at the site of knowledge production and the settler logics that fully shape and structure that encounter between tourist and tour guide. I have a historical chronology in the book that traces the material of contemporary solidarity tours to Zionist land expropriation that began as early as 1908, positioning displacement in Palestine as ongoing and sustained. The 6th chapter, which I'm sharing with you today, archives attempts to reach Gaza through the past 17 years of Israeli siege, during the past 17 years of Israeli siege, culling largely from a digital archive of virtual tours. Through these initiatives, Palestinians in Gaza are combating not only the siege, but representations of Palestinians in Gaza as under siege and nothing more. The chapter walks through some of the myriad forms of virtual tourism that Palestinians in Gaza have crafted before, in between, and after Israeli military incursions into Gaza in 2008 and 9, 2012, and 2014, and how Palestinians in Gaza have worked to circumvent the splintering of Gaza from the rest of Palestine and from the international world at large. With the siege on Gaza in its 17th year, and before this current horrific bombardment, but in between many others, Palestinians in Gaza have described their colonial condition and navigated their cleavage from the rest of Palestine through virtual collaborative projects that rehearse, satirize, and reimagine tourism. These are virtual tours that both describe suffering and create joy. And through these tours, Palestinians in Gaza combat not only the siege, but also representations of themselves as under siege and nothing more. Since Israel has foreclosed even the possibility of occupation tourism in Gaza, Palestinians there have worked to connect the rest of Palestine and the international world at large in forms that resemble tourism. In the larger chapter, I move chronologically through some of the myriad forms of virtual tourism that Palestinians in Gaza have crafted during and in between the Israeli military incursions into Gaza of Operation Cast Lead, 2008 and 9, Pillar of Defense, 2012, and Operation Protective Edge, 2014. I talk about projects as disparate as Gaza mom, blogger, and journalist Layla El-Haddad's collaborative digital tourism project, You Are Not Here, in 2007 and 2009, celebrity chef Anthony Bourdain's widely publicized 2013 trip to Gaza, photographer Tanya Habjuka's 2013 images of Gaza that show joy under context of siege, Palestinian responses to guerrilla artist Banksy's installations in Gaza in 2015, and finally, a 2014 and 15 virtual and transnational student project at Gaza University that imagined another world in which tourism played a key role in a thriving Gaza 2050. I show how since before the siege began and before COVID, when virtual tours of necessity became more routine outside of Gaza as well, Palestinians in Gaza have long used forms of digital connection to resist the fragmentation that Israel has sought to impose on their lives, which underscores how devastating Israel's current routine bombing of telecommunication is, in that it severs Gaza from the rest of the world during a genocidal ground invasion and bombing campaign. In this way, Palestinian guides and organizers and activists in Gaza have constantly and consistently intervened in narratives that circumscribe Palestine to the geographical borders of the West Bank. At the same time, they've interviewed in narratives that position Gaza as solely a site of suffering, a site where tourism could never flourish. They're asking instead, what would it mean if Palestinians in Gaza could actually invite tourists, could host their own tours, could control their own borders, could live freely? Unlike elsewhere in Palestine, the politics of invitation in Gaza are not performative in the sense that they do not produce the effects they seek to name. Except in rare cases, they don't result in the physical presence of tourists in Gaza. However, the politics of invitation are performative in the sense that they're performances that seek to underscore the right to freedom of movement, the right to tourism, and the right to invitation in Palestine. In 2007, designer Moushon Zeraviv and proprietor of the blog Gaza Mom and co-author of Gaza Kitchen, a Palestinian culinary journey, Layla El-Haddad, who's doing an upcoming workshop for workshops for Gaza, which I can put in the chat at the end of the talk, launched a Gaza Tel Aviv virtual tourism project called You Are Not Here. The virtual tour is directed at a Tel Aviv audience of either Israelis or tourists visiting Tel Aviv, and forces the tourists to reckon with the long-standing effects of Israel's colonial occupation of Palestine and the then recent Israeli assault on Gaza, Operation Cast Lead 2008-9. While You Are Not Here's Gaza Tel Aviv virtual tour was launched in 2007, it ceased being active in 2009, but the tour's maps and recordings are archived as ephemera of the now defunct initiative. Tourists are invited to download a PDF of a double-sided map with Gaza on one side and Tel Aviv on the other. Each stop on the tour is marked by a You Are Not Here symbol to parody the You Are Here symbols on so many tourist maps. At each stop, the tourist is invited to call the tourist hotline to hear a recorded guided tour by Layla El-Haddad. In an orchestrated reversal of Israel's history of mapping Israeli site names onto Palestinian spaces, the tour functions by mapping the streets of Gaza onto Tel Aviv. The virtual tour is animated by impossibility. Each recording describes what used to be possible in these spaces in Gaza and what is no longer possible in the wake of Israel's violent and frequent incursions into the Strip. The temporality reflected in each of the 2-minute recordings shifts in seconds from nostalgia for a lost and comparatively more stable past, a present of relative calm amidst intermittent shelling, and an uncertain future. At Barcelona Peace Park, for example, El-Haddad reflects, I remember my own son frolicking around a green patch of field just over there near a group of Shabab youth playing football one spring day. He attempted to climb the monkey bars on the playground, but was a little too young and stuck to the slide instead. She then immediately changes course, but all of that was destroyed by Israeli tanks in January 2009. Now more than anything hopeful, the park's ruins represent the shattered dreams of peace and prosperity and the malicious nature of occupation. In this recording, El-Haddad transports her listener to a nostalgic moment of reprieve for her own son, whose fear in that instant was merely a set of daunting monkey bars. And she reminds her listener of all that has been made impossible since Israel's then most recent assault on Gaza. For a listener strolling down the streets of Tel Aviv, this reminder is meant to be an interruption, a disorienting reminder of their own complicity in the destruction of Gaza. El-Haddad's narrative includes discussions of attacks on UNRWA, which Trump, during his first presidency, tried to defund, withholding $350 million in annual aid from the agency, which of course saw waves of countries beginning in the US defunding UNRWA in January, some of which, like Canada, began to reinstate, and which Israel just banned in Parliament at the end of October. Palestinian demands for the right of return, the history of imprisonment in Gaza, and the then 9,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons, a third without sentencing, many of them children her own son's age. At the same time, she includes on her tour moments of pleasure in Palestine. At Ruth's restaurant and Katham's ice cream parlor, she walks her listener through descriptions of the best things on the menu and offers advice on how to, quote, jostle your way through throngs of thirsty customers. In moments like these, El-Haddad evidences a Gaza that is defined by more than solely siege and disorients a listener expecting only, in Saidiya Hartman's formulation, scenes of subjection. El-Haddad really dwells on these moments of pleasure. She doesn't rush through them or interrupt them to give her listener a reprieve from thinking through the possibilities of Palestinian joy. As a final stop on the tour, El-Haddad introduces her listener to the famous PLO flag shop. She invites them to imagine another possibility.
It's tourist shopping time. As you can see by the sign on the door, we've now reached the self-proclaimed first tourist shop in Palestine, the PLO flag shop. If you'd like to grab some cheap souvenirs for your family back in Tel Aviv, this is a place to do it. The PLO flag shop, run by Abu Diya, gained fame in the 1990s due to its odd collection of everything Arafat souvenirs, including an inflatable punching balloon. But I'm sorry to disappoint you, there's only one of them left, and it's not for sale. Abu Diya's business has gained notoriety for being a political meter of the times, with sales of memorabilia items and flags for diverse use spiking during major events. The inflatable Arafats around his death, the Palestinian and Hamas flags around the disengagement, the Fatah and Hamas flags around the elections, and also the Danish flags around the time of the caricature. Conflict is good business for Abu Diya, but as he often says, I want to run a tourist shop and I want to sell souvenirs, not politics.
So here, Al-Haddad mobilizes tourist conventions not only to point to their impossibility, but also to point to their possibility. To ask her listeners to consider what it would be like if Palestinians in Gaza could host tourists, if they could have the kind of pride and place that stokes tourist initiatives. Reckoning with the kinds of tourism available to him, he says, I want to run a tourist shop and I want to sell souvenirs, not politics. Echoing tour guides I interviewed in the West Bank who wished for the obsolescence of their own profession. Rather than solidarity tour guides, they would love to just be tour guides. The crafting of the tour itself is a stitching together of an otherwise. As Al-Haddad lives in Baltimore, Maryland, and has struggled many times to re-enter Gaza, her work as a tour guide, if virtual, is a project of piecing together. Reliant on her parents, her memories, Wikimapia, and other research, her tour reflects the work Palestinians in exile have to do to remember in a context wherein Israel constantly fragments their land, shatters and/or papers over the physical embodiments of those memories, and then continues to deny them entry. You Are Not Here is then both a memory project for the past and a project for the future, evoking the kind of waiting in exile that Brooklyn-based Palestinian filmmaker Nadia Awad has called a nostalgia for the future. Shifting registers to 2015, in February of that year, guerrilla graffiti artist Banksy went to Gaza to create 3 new pieces there to indict Israel's most recent assault on Palestinians in the coastal enclave. Upon his return, he released a satirical tourist promotional video naming Gaza a hot new tourist destination. It begins with a shot of
It's tourist shopping time. As you can see,
it begins with a shot of clouds from a plane window, interpolating the viewer to make this the year you discover a new destination, followed by the words, "Welcome to Gaza." Throughout, Banksy juxtaposes tourist tropes with facts on the Israeli siege on Gaza. From a point of view of a figure who we're led to believe is Banksy, the viewer too crawls through tunnels and arrives in Gaza to see cement blocks and destroyed buildings alongside children playing. The captions read, "The locals like it so much they never leave," and then in parentheses, "because they're not allowed to." Images of Gaza are paired with the words, "nestled in an exclusive setting," while in parentheses we read, "surrounded by a wall on 3 sides and a line of gunboats on the other." The words "watched over by friendly neighbors" are accompanied by, in parentheses, "in 2014, Operation Protective Edge destroyed 18,000 homes." No words accompany Banksy's art pieces, an image of the Greek goddess Niobe weeping on the still standing wall of a demolished building, ostensibly symbolizing the bereaved mother. An image on the side of another building of a military surveillance tower transformed into an amusement park swing. An image of a cat with an arm extended to play with a ball of coiled up debris. The final shot of the mini film shows writing on a wall, read in all caps, "If we wash our hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless, we side with the powerful, we don't remain neutral." Chickens roam among the shrubbery and piles of trash under the words. Immediately after the release of Banksy's promotional mock tourist invitation, the Gaza parkour team responded to his video with a video of their own, After Banksy, the Parkour Guide to Gaza. In it, they show that there is more to Gaza than falling bombs and destroyed buildings. Instead of taking Banksy's mockery of the inconceivability of tourism in Gaza, it's the joke he tries to make it, they treat tourism seriously and treat his video as a provocation to instead detail why tourism in Gaza has been rendered so impossible. I'll play the full video for you here.
صباح الخير يا ولاد عمومنا فضلوا شرفونا شو بتحب مضيفكم دم عربي ولا الدموع من عيوننا بعتقد هيك تأملوا نستقبل من هيك تعقدوا لما تدركموا على غلطة من
Yes, Banksy, captain's government state of Gaza. My name is Abdul Gassaf. Nearly 50% of us unemployed, and we are very available to show you around. Welcome to Gaza! I'm sure we can find a place for you to stay, but there are around 12,000 people here in Gaza needing homes and needing houses. But with no construction materials coming in here in Gaza, we can't reply. We have a lot of friends and neighbors around us, and they keep their eyes on us. This comes and goes. In Gaza, we must be patient in everything. We can offer you bread and water, but actually most of the water here isn't drinkable, and bottled water is too expensive. But we are happy to share with you. We are here in the port Sea of Gaza. There is a lot of people come here because the situation in Gaza is very difficult. They look at the sea, they want to go out, they want to see the world, we want to see the parkour teams, we want to see everything because we want to do a lot of things, you know, and we dreams a lot. Despite all of this happening in Gaza, we are here and alive, and our spirit is very strong. So come and discover us and make Gaza your destination.
So while Banksy wants to foreground the real inconceivability, right, of play in Gaza, the impossibility of a military surveillance tower turned into an amusement park ride, the teenagers training off his art belie that claim. The team's performance and the choice of venue intervene in both Israeli state-sanctioned narratives that erase the past and present of Palestinians living in Palestine, and disaster tourist narratives that position Palestine and Palestinians as besieged and nothing more. In After Banksy, the Parkour Guide to Gaza, Gaza's parkour team plays with the landscape of loss they have inherited. They also play with the impossibilities of tourism in Gaza, taking up the role of informal tour guides, correcting the singular lens of unfathomable devastation that animated Banksy's video, and detailing the multiple ways they would be happy to host, happy for the employment, happy to share their food, and if they could, their water. The parkour team in Gaza makes it clear that Banksy's installation pieces provide an incomplete narrative, one that pivots solely on devastation and evacuates the question of hope, one that positions tourism as a joke instead of a potentiality under different conditions. Walking by the sea, they explain that they spend their time there because they want to go out, see the sea, see the world, meet other parkour teams. In this way, their critique illuminates the conditions of their isolation, expressing not only a desire to host tourists, but also a desire to be tourists. And here I'm always reminded of the words of an international tour guide I interviewed as we sat in a cafe in Beit Safor, who said, you know, Palestinians, they have a right to tourism. This reminds me immediately of footage from a year ago, or now 6 months ago, in Gaza at Al-Quds hospital under consistent threat of Israeli occupation forces. It's footage of a steadfastness that is in play under siege and under constant bombardment.
يلا العب يلا طبعا هذه مستشفى القدس للاحتلال الاسرائيلي كل يوم بهدد باستهدافها. الناس هنا موجودين من الضحك هذا حبيبي. الناس موجودين ثابتين اكثر من 12,000 نسمه، كلهم موجودين في المستشفى ونحن موجودين. مستشفى القدس يلا ايه؟ كمان يلا يسعدك يا شملة. وين احنا موجودين؟ يلا العب. يلا. طبعا هذه مستشفى القدس من الاحتلال الاسرائيلي كل يوم بهدد باستهداف.
When I began doing teach-ins on Gaza a year ago, Israel had warned the hospital to evacuate before its bombing, an evacuation that would be completely impossible for sick patients, let alone the 12,000 sheltering there, not to mention the impossibility of navigating roads because of Israeli airstrikes, as Israel had been launching airstrikes at and around the hospital to force an evacuation. Months ago, the scene at Al-Quds was dire, catastrophic. The hospital was completely non-functional and they were completely without fuel. No one could leave or get in. All roads were closed. There was a complete cutoff of communication and internet, and Israeli occupation forces were ceaselessly bombarding the hospital and preventing anyone from reopening it, while demanding an impossible evacuation, with hundreds of wounded people and staff to one of the hospitals still operating in the south, as Israeli forces continued to make all hospitals non-functional. Today, Israel bombing hospitals in Gaza has become absolutely routine state practice. Israel laid siege on Al-Shifa hospital for weeks in May, committing massacre after massacre and detaining and displacing hundreds, leaving behind unfathomable scenes of horror and destruction. More recently than that, Israel laid siege with bombs and snipers on Al-Auda hospital and then Kamal Adwan hospital. None of us will forget 19-year-old Shiban Al-Dula burned alive with his Al-Dalu burned alive with his IVs still in the courtyard of Al-Aqsa hospital last month. It is endless. One final snapshot called the Gaza Strip 2050. During the 2014 to 15 academic school year, in collaboration with Indiana University in Indianapolis and under the joint guidance of Director of International Partnerships at Indiana, Ian McIntosh, and Director of International Affairs at Gaza University, Jamil Al-Falit, students in Gaza were asked to chart a vision for Gaza in 2050 that did precisely that. Through research, interviews, field trips, video conference calls, and meetings with archivists and archaeologists, students in Gaza identified tourism as the key to a renewed and thriving economy. Together, students in Gaza and students in Indianapolis attempted to craft a virtual museum where they identified 252 sites of touristic potential alongside an imagined overlaid pilgrimage route connecting Gaza City and Jerusalem. These imagined tourist stops hinge on mobility. When asked to envision Gaza 2050, the students placed connection at the center of their vision, bypassing the fragmentation and circumscription that occupied their lives and severed them from family, friends, and strangers in the West Bank, Jerusalem, Israel, and the diaspora. Gaza, students explained, would return to its former status as the jewel of the Mediterranean, yet not in its pre-1948 version, but in a contemporary, thriving, bustling 2050 iteration. The students' visioning exercise, which they had just begun to put into practice, came to an abrupt halt with Operation Protective Edge, the brutal assault on Gaza that Israel had launched on July 7th, 2014. Operation Protective Edge lasted 50 days. Between July 7th and August 26th, Israel murdered 2,131 Palestinians. 18,000 housing units were destroyed, rendering 108,000 Palestinians in Gaza homeless. Civilian infrastructure was decimated. Israel bombed Gaza's only power plant on July 29th, referenced so deliberately by the parkour team. This bombing caused the shutdown of water treatment plants, while other attacks destroyed Gaza's largest sewage treatment plant. Students saw 22 of their schools destroyed, 6 of their teachers killed. Industry and commerce suffered immensely, with 419 businesses damaged and 128 destroyed entirely. Agriculture and fishing sectors suffered, with access to the sea prohibited and 42,000 acres of cropland destroyed. The damage during this bombardment far exceeds that, in both scope and scale, as these visualizing Palestine infographics show. From 18 days into this invasion, and then 48, and then 80, and then 130, and we are now at over 400, with 200,000 murdered, over 40% children, not including the many, or including the many missing under the rubble, the numbers that are impossible to account for grasp. At the end of the 2014 to 15 academic school year, it remained unknown how many of the 252 tourist sites in Gaza that students identified still existed, and the virtual museum did not come to fruition. But the ephemera identified, the labor undertaken, and the collaboration crafted reveal much about the impossibilities of tourism in Gaza. Students in Gaza, with their interlocutors in Indianapolis, researched, conducted interviews, and went on tours of their own to learn histories denied to them and papered over by a present of imminent and intermittent destruction. They paused to reflect on what tourism could do, what its potentialities could be. In doing so, they positioned tourism as part of an anti-colonial project. Their vision resisted the colonial foreclosure of movement imposed on them that cleaved them from Jerusalem. Their vision negated the colonial erasure of their histories and cultural objects. Their vision named the colonial looting of Palestine and Palestinian art and artifacts. Their vision allowed them a thriving Palestinian agricultural sector that Israeli colonial state practice has worked so hard to destroy. And their vision restored the beauty and pride in place that colonial devaluations of personhood and land has sought to entrench. Their Gaza 2050 positioned tourism as key, and not just key as a synonym for central, but also, I think, key in reference to Palestinian return, with Palestinians displaced in 48 still holding their keys to their homes and passed down generationally. With Palestinians in Gaza in 2018 and 19 marching toward return every day in the face of Israel's attempts to foreclose their vision of a life undefined by colonial rule. And today, with a small fraction of journalists in Gaza who are still alive after the past year, still showing up every day to record their history. For reference, Israel murdered 44 journalists between 2000 and 2022. In the past 13 months, Israel has murdered 128 journalists. Under siege and in between bombs, Palestinians have labored to imagine an otherwise. Tourism has figured centrally into these imaginings. And this is a speculative fiction piece from a speculative fiction piece in 972 magazine describing Gaza tours after liberation. Through collaborative, creative, transnational, and virtual tourism projects, Palestinians in Gaza, from activists to professors to students to chefs to shop owners to performers, have asked what it would mean if they could exercise their right to host tourists. In this, they've intervened in Israel's attempts to sever them from the rest of Palestine and the international world. At the same time, Palestinians in Gaza have sought to intervene in internationally circulated images of Gaza as solely a site of destruction. Subverting conventional imagery of the region, they have demanded an understanding of Gaza beyond subjection. In between the immeasurable loss they've experienced in the wake of Operation Cast Lead, Pillar of Defense, Protective Edge, and now Operation Iron Swords, Palestinians in Gaza have attempted to teach life through tourism. On teaching life, here is Palestinian poet Rafi Sayada.
I'll start with this poem. I wrote this poem when the bombs were dropping on Gaza, and I was the media spokesperson for the coalition, doing a lot of the organizing. And we had stayed up to about 6 o'clock in the morning, perfecting every soundbite. And by the end, if you're Palestinian, you know most Palestinians get tired and start pronouncing our P's as B's. So we become Palestinians by the end of the day. So I was practicing my P's all night. And the next morning, one of the journalists asked me, "Don't you think it would all be fine if you just stopped teaching your children to hate?" I did not insult the person. I was very polite. But I wrote this poem as a response to these types of questions we Palestinians always get. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre that had to fit into sound bites and word limits. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre that had to fit into sound bites and word limits, filled enough with statistics to counter measured response. And I perfected my English and I learned my UN resolutions. But still, he asked me, "Ms. Ziyada, don't you think everything would be resolved if you would just stop teaching so much hatred to your children?" Pause. I look inside of me for strength to be patient, but patience is not at the tip of my tongue as the bombs drop over Gaza. Patience has just escaped me. Pause. Smile. We teach life, sir. Rafif, remember to smile. Pause. we teach life, sir. We Palestinians teach life after they have occupied the last sky. We teach life after they have built their settlements and apartheid walls. After the last skies, we teach life, sir. But today, my body was a TV'd massacre made to fit into sound bites and word limits. And just give us a story, a human story. You see, this is not political. We just want to tell people about you and your people. So give us a human story. Don't mention that word apartheid and occupation. This is not political. You have to help me as a journalist to help you tell your story, which is not a political story. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre. How about you give us a story of a woman in Gaza who needs medication? How about you? Do you have enough bone-broken limbs to cover the sun? Hand me over your dead and give me the list of their names in 1,200 word limits. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre made to fit into sound bites and word limits and move those that are desensitized to terrorist blood. But they felt sorry. They felt sorry for the cattle over Gaza. So I give them UN resolutions and statistics, and we condemn and we deplore and we reject. And these are not two equal sides, occupier and occupied, and 100 dead, 200 dead, and 1,000 dead. And between that war crime and massacre, I vent out words and smile, not exotic. Smile, not terrorist. And I recount 100 dead, 200 dead, 1,000 dead. Is anyone out there? Will anyone listen? I wish I could wail over their bodies. I wish I could just run barefoot in every refugee camp and hold every child, cover their ears so they wouldn't have to hear the sound of bombing for the rest of their life the way I do. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre, and let me just tell you, there is nothing your UN resolutions have ever done about this. And no soundbite I come up with, no matter how good my English gets, no soundbite will bring them back to life. No soundbite will fix this. We teach life, sir. We teach life, sir. We Palestinians wake up every morning to teach the rest of the world life, sir.
Palestinians in Gaza have attempted to teach life by reminding tourists that while they are not there, they can still work to disrupt their complacency by celebrating Palestinian food and lifeways that Israel has repeatedly attempted to destroy, by foregrounding their own pleasure in a context imagined to foreclose it, by asking viewers what it would look like if they were allowed to be tour guides of their own homeland. And they have attempted to teach life by crafting their own Gaza 2050, a world in which they can take tourists from Gaza City to Jerusalem, introduce tourists to the rich history of their land, and move freely from one site of significance to another across Palestine. In this way, Palestinians in Gaza have imagined an otherwise, in between military incursions that seek to decimate their communities. Through virtual tours across time and space, they have described and resisted their containment. They have foregrounded what brings them joy, and they have insisted on their own futures. I want to end with a meditation on what is incumbent on all of us as witnesses to this genocide. Again, the first ask of witnesses to a genocide is to believe Palestinians when they speak. A lifetime commitment to the work of reading, of learning from Palestine, of taking in the literature, the narratives, the scholarship from Palestine and its diaspora as a daily practice of turning and returning to Palestinian studies to understand what we are witnessing. The second ask is what Palestinian writer and clinical psychologist Hala Alian defines as the work of the witness, including the diasporic witness, to remain undistracted and undeterred. Through the labor of enumeration, the listing we do over and over again, we repeat: Israel has murdered near 200,000 Palestinians, over 40% of them children, flattened neighborhoods and cities, deleted entire families from the civil registry, relentlessly bombed hospitals and universities and bakeries, and armed settlers in the West Bank, where settlers and soldiers have murdered hundreds of Palestinians. We repeat all the other lists that the US is funding all this violence at a minimum of $3.8 billion per year and 6 times that this year. And the majority of the weapons killing Palestinians are manufactured in the US, in which our universities are complicit. The US vetoes every international attempt to hold Israel accountable at the United Nations. The massacres Israel's committing every day would be impossible without the US enabling and exonerating Israel at every turn. This listing, the enumerating, feels futile, but it is not. It has nourished the sea change that makes Palestinian journalists household names, that has made encampments grow, that has brought people into the movement. The work is in continuing to remember, to name, to list, to diagnose past and present Israeli state violence until it comes to its inevitable end. The third ask then is to act over and over again every day as much as you list, to not watch Palestinians be killed one by one and do nothing, to speak about Palestine wherever you go, to scream for a ceasefire in every corner of your world, to spend hours online in your city council resolution meetings, to refuse to confuse discomfort with danger, to not be afraid to face baseless accusations of anti-Semitism, to make calling your representatives part of your daily practice, even if they ignore you, to do the long work to sustain disruption, from protests to shutdowns to bail funds to demanding drop charges, to know who is doing the work and have the difficult strategy conversations that grow movements, to find community and collective outrage, to speak truth in all the worlds you inhabit. Organizers and scholars alike have defined solidarity as what love looks like in public. This includes accepting the potential risks of that love. Solidarity means taking on the risk of speaking against genocide and fighting for a world where speaking out is in such collectivity that it is no longer a risk. Solidarity means understanding what the ask is. Solidarity means stopping business as usual, drawing businesses invested in occupation to a grinding halt, shutting down weapons manufacturers through direct actions. And it means building communities where people radically love each other in ways that sustain the work, where we normalize and model caretaking, taking breaks, stepping in when others need a break, showing up for each other whenever possible, day after day. I want to stress that this is not just the work of today or tomorrow or this week or this year, but it's lifetime work. The work of renewing your resolve, taking radical care of each other, continuing to read, enumerate, and act until Palestine is free. Finally, I just want to talk about two more aspects of this work. One, doing it within the space of the university, and two, under the ever-present specter of police violence, a redundancy of term, as many scholars of policing argue, since policing is violence. Those of us who work and learn and think within the university have every obligation to grind its operations to a halt until it divests from the war machine. With no functioning universities left in Gaza, we must hold our universities accountable, as many just did yesterday with the People's Tribunal charging the UC of genocide, which I can also link to the recording of that in the chat, for the harm that they enable and then feign as inevitable. That cops off campus has been a central encampment demand, including across the UCs, as it was at UCSC, speaks to the many ways that Black liberation, Palestinian liberation organizers and researchers and theorists have long connected the abolition of prisons and policing to the struggle for a free Palestine. As we learn from those who study colonialism and policing, militarized policing is redundant since the professionalization of policing dovetailed with the militarization of policing in the Philippines. Police violence is redundant because policing is violence. Racist policing is redundant because policing has always taken shape in and through racism, through enforcing enslavement, through protecting colonial expansion. So as we read, enumerate, and act, as we ground ourselves in Palestinian scholarship and insist on Palestinian futures, we must also condemn scholasticide and insist on the right everywhere to an education that is not under bombs and siege. And we also must insist on our campuses without cops. Campuses where students and those who teach and learn from them are safe from racialized violence, from military occupation to police presence. Our collective commitment toward divestment, disclosure, boycott until the liberation, ending the erasure of Palestine from our classrooms, ending the silence, ending the repression, and insisting on cops off campus. These are encampment commitments that insist on a futurity that hinges on decolonization, a futurity that treats Palestinian life as precious, and a futurity that resists the business as usual of death-dealing industry. A futurity that actually translates to a future of radical care and love for us all. A future where Palestine is free, and a future where abolition means the abolition of policing, prisons, militarism, and colonial violence everywhere. I wrote this book on witnessing and solidarity in Palestine, but I am no expert in the face of the staggering and incalculable horror that we have witnessed for over a year. My students routinely ask me, how do you or we keep doing this work when it feels like nothing changes and it feels like the work itself is always under attack? And there are no easy answers, of course. Most days I also feel helpless as the carnage haunts me from my phone. Every time I close my eyes or look at my own babies, the life in their cheeks, I feel the loss and horror of every grieving parent in Gaza in my bones. I go through the motions in a daze, like so many of us do, when the wins seem small against a behemoth that so few political leaders have the desire, will, or courage to stop. And then I think about the work of the witness, right? And the work of solidarity and how this work requires nourishment. It requires us to allow ourselves to feel helpless until we renew our resolve, until we recommit over and over again to reading, enumerating, and acting. I have an 8-week-old newborn, and I'm constantly reminded that she is not a retreat from this world or this work, but a recommitment to it. I remind myself that solidarity with Palestine is a public love that I choose every day through acts and work until Palestine is free from the river to the sea. Every day in Gaza, Palestinians are teaching life while they're being subjected to death. They're making sure their children have the space to play in between bombs. They are comforting their babies as they flee. They are sharing their scarce food they have with one another as Israel starves them. They're pulling each other from the rubble. They are risking their lives to make their stories heard. As they teach life, the very least we can do is amplify their pedagogy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for this deeply, deeply moving and powerful talk, and for your research, and for, yeah, you have given us so much to think with and feel with. So, folks, I'm sure you're still the audience processing what you heard. But yeah, please feel free to type your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll take them as they come. And you have told us a lot about this, but while we wait for others to respond to your deeply moving talk, as I was reading your book over this last days, I was thinking about how you tell us in your book about the Palestinians' invitation to be tourists, to be soldier to tourists, to come, despite, the many imperfections or contradictions that kind of going to Palestine, like using a lot of privileges that folks have, especially from US, right? And kind of what that means, and how the tour guides, you're telling us, like, do this pedagogical labor of trying to channel people's understandings and preconceptions and desires and feelings into politically amenable ways towards Palestinian decolonization. And I was thinking about over the last year, as you already mentioned, as we have been kind of perhaps invited to maybe a similar or different form of witnessing as both journalists, but also kind of everyday people from Palestine have produced content, especially from Gaza, to that kind of the act of producing it and putting it into circulation, perhaps in your words, even the words of your book, is a demand for, as an invitation, right, to be in Gaza, an invitation to witness. And as you just shared toward the end of your talk, that's hard work. A lot of times I found myself wanting to distract, look away, ridden with, guilt and shame and just horror and fear and helplessness. And those are really difficult feelings to sit with. And at other times, I also felt conflicted and kind of like, even in the act of witnessing, being in my living room and, like knowing that my child is safe, sleeping in his bathroom, and just kind of the other leisurely things that I do on my phone, you know, like after I'm done with my workday, you know, maybe I'll look next to like a picture of like you know, like somebody ate what somebody had for their dinner next, right? Kind of the leisureliness or the kind of the connection to leisure of like that act of witnessing on my phone. Uh, so perhaps you can help us kind of think about this, like all these diff challenges and contradictions of the kinds of witnessing that we have been invited toward last year, the virtual ones, and like how what you learned from the Palestinian tour guides, the solidarity tour guides, might help us navigate this moment in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a couple, like several things. Like one is the kind of disjuncture between exactly what you're talking about, which is witnessing this horror on your phone that's sort of spliced with witnessing the safety of your own babies that are safe and warm and well fed. I mean, this has been a constant. I feel like this for so many of us, it's like spliced, life is spliced between this everyday horror and then this really like scenes of safety and security that are also split with these other moments of state violence. So what your question is making me think a lot about is the kind of space of the encampment, right? And how the encampment, for example, at Santa Cruz was 30 days, and at the People's Tribunal yesterday, our students spoke and sort of gave their own testimony of the police raid on the encampment, but also spoke about how the 30 days preceding that were the space of imagining and otherwise, right? Were the space of having food insecure students fed, were the space of having everyone on the same page of working toward a liberated Palestine, of a space of working out the kind of like fractures and organizing that make that difficult, but the necessary work of having those conversations, and then this kind of violence of the police raid that so many of our universities across the UCs and beyond the UCs unleashed on us and our students, fracturing that space. And so I think that so many of our students have navigated this splicing right across their worlds, and we as faculty have navigated that in many ways too. And for me, it's a just a sort of it's the landscape of this year of doing the work of the kind of like profound heartbreaking clarity that this year has also provided so many of us in knowing like who has been silent for a year. Like I think about this as a new mom, a mom to an 8-week-old and a mom to a 3-year-old, and I think of like mom communities and how many like mom influencers and kind of parenting world has chosen to completely ignore something where the violence is felt most by 5 to 9-year-olds, right? And have chosen for over a year to say nothing. And the kinds of, so I think that there's also this kind of like clarity people are confronted with in their own worlds, clarity around who has remained silent to protect their own jobs and their own lives and their own security, and clarity around who has come out. I know for us in FJP, this has felt really real, like who has come out who we didn't know before, like who the encampments brought together for organizing that will be with us our whole lives, right? As we work all together collectively for a liberated Palestine. So I think that is something we've all navigated. And one insight from the tour guides that I feel like animates this work or helps guide this work, I guess, is a couple things. One, when I first started the dissertation research, I would ask tour guides, like what it was like to constantly recite like this enumeration, right? This constant recitation of Israeli state violence, constant recitation of UN resolutions ignored, constant recitation of encroaching settlements and land expropriation and the statistics of the ongoing Nakba. And I would ask them, like, what is it like to do that work? And I would expect like a scene of subjection. I would expect them to talk about how traumatizing it was to do that work of recitation, when oftentimes they would talk about how, like, the mechanics of it. They would talk about it being like numbing, right? And being like having something, like they would make jokes about there's always something new because there's always a new settlement, or there's always, like, so it doesn't get boring, right? They would answer in these ways that were not the kind of scripted answer that you would look for with a question like that, right? So it taught me to like rethink the kinds of questions I would ask. And then I think of other moments where tour guides would watch like tourists go through refugee camps in Bethlehem or in other places and take like non-consensual pictures of Palestinian kids. And the tour guide would be talking to me and be like, I just watch them. And I'm like, what, you don't have babies in your country? Like, I don't understand. So there's this whole other kind of like fetishization of suffering that happens, where tour guides were constantly doing this work of recitation, constantly doing the work of connection, even though they have to do that work of recitation, and constantly able to like satirize and think through the kind of absurdities of what it means to consume state violence on the part of someone who's not subjected to it. So I think that tour guides have so much to teach about this moment, in the same way that journalists on the ground in Palestine are also doing like deeply pedagogical work, are also inviting international audiences to engage, to share, to speak, to do something with that work. Like, it's an invitation that has sutured into it a responsibility, an invitation that has sutured into it an obligation to not be the person who has said nothing in the past 13 months, right? To insist on disrupting, insist on refusing to prioritize comfort, and in all of these interactions at work and families and schools and the classroom, and understanding the risks of the invitation, like the risks of that work, which is an invitation to solidarity and an invitation to not just witness, but actually be be responsible for what you are being like invited to witness and what you're being allowed to witness.
Thanks so much, Jenny. I'm hearing you're emphasizing community and kind of leaning into some of this discomfort and perhaps difficult feelings towards responsibility, towards community, towards action. I see that there are 2 questions and
So from Mariana, thank you so much for your time and dedication and love for liberated Palestine. As a fellow advocate, I struggle with guilt by witnessing families asking for help via TikTok. I'm a believer of holding space for conflicting emotions, yet what are methods you do for self-care and sustainable rejuvenation while the times of helplessness and grief? Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I think there's a lot. I think it's very easy to feel guilty for taking care of yourself, right? During this horror. And I think what I learn all the time in organizing spaces, in pedagogical spaces that have liberation at their core, is that the work has to be done in collectivity, and we have to be able to rely on each other to pick up when we can't. And so I think that we've witnessed, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you who are organizers have witnessed a lot of like collapse around capacity, right? And in those moments, that's like what part of inviting people into movement work is and needs to be, is inviting them in with these conversations about accountability, with principles of unity, right? and doing that work under the collective belief that you all pick up when each other can't, right? And I think many of us have learned these kind of lessons. I can speak to like FJP, but also ICSZ organizing, the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, where we begin, right, with principles of unity around Zionism as a racial settler project, around Israel as a settler colonial state, and having those kinds of terms set for the conversation so that you're not devolving into these like conversations that are that take you away from the organizing work. And then understanding that like sometimes you see in organizing spaces where people get really wedded to like burnout and wedded to doing everything and wedded to like not relinquishing control. And a lot of times you learn over and over again that when you have to step back, other people step in and they do it beautifully, and they do it in ways that are like more creative and more far-reaching and more sustaining than you could, right? And so I think being able to like come to the work humbly, and being able to come to the work knowing that you are not going to be able to do everything, and you're going to have to step back, and you have to count on your comrades to step in when you step back. And that's part of like creating the work, creating the principles of the work so that you can build that trust. And so that helps me when, for example, like I had an emergency C-section 2 weeks early and couldn't do a lot that I had planned to do in those 2 weeks, and my comrades did it, and they did it beautifully. And like it's a lesson that like you can't do everything, and if you did do everything, you're spread so thin that it's like diminishing returns sometimes. So I think like destigmatizing self-care as selfish is really important. At the same time that there is a whole world of self-care influencers too that say things like paying attention to the genocide in Gaza is like lowering vibrations, right? And they avoid it in order to prioritize self-care, which is which is complicity in genocide at every level, right? So I think understanding what you mean by self-care and when and how your self-care sustains movement work are important questions to ask, right? Leandro, thank you so much for your talk. Your scholarship is so important and inspiring. Thank you. My question is, how do you see the role of international personalities like Banksy and Anthony Bourdain in shaping global perspectives on Gaza? Do you believe their influence enhances or detracts from Palestinian-led narratives? Does their work even matter in the face of the horrors Gaza has faced in the last year? This is such an important question. I think about this all the time. I think about this with like Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? Like with the kinds of report back genre of where in those moments, people like Anthony Bourdain, kind of like celebrity culture, the function of those report backs is prioritizing non-Palestinian voices, right? That is the purpose of them, because Palestinian voices are rendered suspect, right? They're rendered incapable of describing their own condition, biased, everything. And so it requires the international celebrity kind of influencer type to corroborate those narratives. That is absolutely true, and absolutely a problem, and absolutely a problem that Palestinian organizers recognize when they ask those people to do those report backs. So it is acknowledging the asymmetries of the ask, and acknowledging and this is what solidarity tour guides do too, on a micro level. They're not always, some delegations are kind of more celebrity folks, but most delegations are just tourists. But it is asking tourists to use their platforms and use their privilege and use their reach to disrupt complacency around Israeli state violence and complicity in it. So I think that they can detract from, can detract from Palestinian-led narratives, but what those folks who are celebrity influencers can do is, again, and this is why I'm constantly like returning to Palestinian studies, because what they can do is uphold Palestinian literature and point the people who listen to them, who only believe them because they're not Palestinian, they can point them to Palestinian literature, right? And Palestinian scholarship and Palestinian narratives of their own condition. So when a report back traffics only in what I witnessed, right? When a person who goes to Palestine comes back and only talks about what they witnessed and doesn't talk about the scores of literature Palestinians have produced on their own condition, they are missing an opportunity to provide their readers or their viewers or their audience with a world of scholarship that they may never have encountered, right? Since Palestinian scholarship and literature is so censored, as we see in our classrooms and our universities, right? So I think that it absolutely can detract from Palestinian-led narratives. It can also be an opportunity for those people with a platform to actually like listen to Palestinians and amplify their Palestinian scholarship, Palestinian literature, and Palestinian studies instead of speaking about Palestine without any Palestinian voices, which happens all the time. And I think, does their work even matter in the face of horrors of Gaza faced in the last year? I think that a lot of it does turn, a lot of the function of report backs turns people who wouldn't listen otherwise. And I think that that's like, that's about racism, right? That's about anti-Palestinian racism. And it is part of the landscape that causes journalists to be like, what else do we have to show you? Like there's so much with tour guides and journalists that are like, what else do you need to see to understand this 100 years of terror, right? And I think that work is like constant repetitious or work of repetition, that is a labor, and it is a labor that the people who do it know like all of its problems and all of its asymmetries as they do it, and they do it anyway because it does make a difference. I don't think they would do that work or make those calls or do those asks or turn to this kind of tourism in the first place if it were ineffectual, right? Christina, oh, there's a lot. Let me get through these. Reading the book had me thinking a lot about solidarity, privilege, and complicity, and how to fathom and process the indirect shame and privilege positionality of reading and learning new things about genocidal violence. The report back practices genre of solidarity tourists while justifiably contested in the asymmetrical power relations over narratives of displacement and the disparate strategies they use to translate it to ignorant, skeptical, indifferent, or hostile U.S. audiences, I hope speaks to how Palestinian narratives of voices and projects like this may be retranslated in various contexts. Yeah, and I think that the kind of like incremental chipping away is part of the project, right? And it's part of and this reminds me of like, a lot of times when people talk about Palestine, even people who are also invested in a liberated Palestine, the word intractable is like sutured to conflict, where Palestine is neither, right? It is neither, Israeli occupation of Palestine is neither intractable nor a conflict, right? And it's not a conflict because it's a settler colonial military occupation, and it's not intractable. And I think that the idea that it's if we believed that it were intractable, if we believed that there was nothing to be done about it, there's no reason to do this work, right? And as so many Palestinian journalists, Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinians everywhere have said, right, like we cannot afford to be hopeless. We cannot afford to be despondent, right? And so the idea that's intractable is part of the way that like these initiatives, flawed as they are so necessary, right? And they're, even though they seem like this kind, a lot of the ways it's about the way that people talk about this is why it's pedagogical work, right? Because the way people talk about teaching is like you don't see the effects of teaching in the moment. You see it years later, right? When students reach out to you in years and years past when they were in your class. And this is the kind of, tour guides would be like, if I have a tour of 20 and I get through to 5 of them and 5 of them organize their communities, that's what my work is worth it, right? And so those other 15 who are like all the voices and the labor is lost on become irrelevant, right? Compared to the 5 who do something with that work. So I think, this question of like why the report back genre and how it functions and why it functions in the way that it does is such an important question about who's believed when they speak, and how to, if you are someone who's believed when you speak, how to redirect that belief system, right? How to redirect that veracity barometer to voices that are not believed when they speak. Christina, coming from South Korea, I also grapple with the question of complexity, retranslating these narratives to non-US and sometimes non-English speaking audience, often uncritically exposed to narratives propagated by Israel, partly imported, retranslated, or reshaped through various Korean media. I wanted to ask if you could talk more about or introduce resources for accessing instances of conveying these narratives in non-US context, perhaps different analogies used and their efficacies and limitations for speaking about Palestine. For instance, I've seen the Palestine Peace Solidarity Organization South Korea talk about the limitations of drawing analogies to Japanese colonialism that often merely prompt anti-Japanese sentiment and neglect historical context, sometimes reinforcing the power logics that drive structures of occupation, settler colonialism, and erasing the complicity of South Korea's conglomerates in Israeli genocidal violence. Totally. I can put the link to the book in its entirety in the chat because it's open access. I use my research funds to make sure that like anyone could read it and anyone can download the chapters. So, and I have a chapter about analogy, because what happens in a US context is that people will treat Palestine. We often see, my partner works on Puerto Rico. We often talk about how people will say the refrain of like, Puerto Rico is the last colony, or Palestine is the last colony. And these kinds of declarations that are meant to index urgency, what they actually do, of course, is treat other colonized spaces as beyond decolonization, right? As already settled, as spaces where there's nothing you can do anything about, whereas in Palestine, you can still do something about colonialism, as though you can't still do something about colonialism with land back initiatives across Turtle Island, right? As though you can't do something about colonialism elsewhere in all these other colonial contexts. So I think being mindful of like the work our analogies do is really important. It reminds me of this one moment where a tour guide, we were at the wall in Bethlehem, and a tourist was like horrified that Israel would rename Palestinian spaces. And the guide was like, well, where are you from? And she was like, Bethesda. And he was like, well, what's the indigenous name of Bethesda? And she was like, well, I don't know, they're all dead, right? And it was this complete like abdication of responsibility for learning about her own space, abdication of responsibility for learning about like the Indigenous Cultural Center, the Piscataway Cultural Center, which is 30 minutes away from where she lives, but she wouldn't be bothered to learn that, but she would be bothered to go to Palestine and be outraged there, right? So understanding the kinds of like what work analogies do and the violences that analogies can recreate and reenact is really important solidarity work. And I think what you're flagging is also like the importance of audience, right? And the importance of context and like knowing, and this is the like calculations that tourists do all the time in crafting report back genres. So I have a part in the book that talks about a person who is a Christian anti-Zionist organizer who worked in different spaces from Kentucky to Indiana about, and like with a farming community versus like more affluent communities, and the kinds of things that work on each of those audiences, right? So they're constantly doing this like calculation of like what narrative resonates with who. And sometimes that calculation is one where, like, I wrote an article for Sapiens that starts with talking about like what you're witnessing. And even that is like an article where like urgency produces this kind of argument that I don't want to make, but you make it for the urgency of the moment, right? So it's this argument that's like, what are we all witnessing? What can you not unsee? What is staying with you this year? When like that is not the focus. That is not what we need to be focused on, but for people reading that and like people who are kind of stuck in their own question of like consumption of violence, it is. So it's always these kind of calculations of like what is resonating for what audience and how and why. And I think constantly asking those questions and being attuned like to hearing the answer, even if it makes your work harder, it means it's an important question to be asking. Chris, this was beautiful. Thanks. Such sharp and timely analyses. Thank you, Chris. I love thinking about solidarity tourism as pedagogical work. Such an important dimension of pedagogy is relationality. So I'm wondering if you have any insights on the relational work, the ethics of care, responsibility, et cetera, that go along with solidarity tourism, and any connections you see between this more intimate relational work and the political work of being invited to witness. Thanks, Jenny. Absolutely. So like one of the things that really came through in my research was like that tourists would be really surprised that there was so much hanging out in Palestine. So they would be like, I would be like, what, I would ask them, you know, what resonated with you? What of your tour stayed with you? What are you still thinking about? And they would answer by saying like, I didn't expect to make friends in the way that I did. I didn't expect to be hanging out so much in the way that I did. And I think that is part of the expectation like baked into the way that the way that like Orientalism structures relations to Palestine is also through the idea that like hanging out would be so foreign, right? As opposed to thinking about anywhere else you would go where you would make friends and hang out and like smoke cigarettes and like talk about movies and like talk about and like laugh and have these kinds of, the idea that you would go somewhere that would be completely evacuated of that is part of the way that Palestine has been narrated, right? The kinds of images that people are willing to like consume and think through with Palestine. So I think that the kinds of like friendship crafting that it does model an ethics of care and responsibility, and I think a lot of the tourists restructure their relationship to Palestine after their tours as one of caretaking for their friends, right? And thinking through the tour guides as their friends. And I think this is not limited to tourists, right? I think this is also expansive to researchers. This is also about the kinds of like, what does it mean if you and it does engage this question of pedagogy, because if you go somewhere and you understand it as pedagogical, meaning you're going there to learn, you're not going there necessarily with this like ethos of superiority, right? Which some tour guides have to confront, especially with like thematic delegations, especially with like influencers or kind of celebrity culture folks, and also not going with a kind of extractivist relationship, which is what many researchers go to Palestine with, right? But if you think about relations and you think about friendships and you think about responsibility to friendships across differently positioned people in a colonial encounter, right? You are thinking through those kinds of ethics of care. So I think there's so much here in this question around like, what is pedagogy? What is the ethics of care? Who are you responsible to when you've been entrusted with a narrative, right? And not only like responsible to when you've been entrusted with a narrative from a teacher, but also entrusted with responsibility of a narrative from a friend, from someone you have a sort of intimate relationship with, and then there are all these other kinds of questions that crop up around like who and how those relationships shift, like what that responsibility looks like, right? And a lot of times you see like a kind of privileging a friendship as an abdication of doing more work, right? Like you see this in US context all the time around like when people use their friends as alibis for their racism, right? And so thinking through like, what does it actually mean to cultivate friendship? What does it actually mean to cultivate care? And those are really hard questions with hard answers that I think it behooves us to think about in a pedagogical way, like in the space of a classroom, and to keep asking this question, like to keep asking what relational work looks like in each time we are asked to witness something, right? Each time that we're entrusted with a narrative, what does an ethics of care look like? And I think in research, we think about that, like Indigenous studies offers so much around ethics of care in research. If you think about like, whose stories are whose to tell, right? And whose voice is privileged in the retelling. So I think all these questions have everything to do with like how we imagine care and how we imagine relations. So thank you.
Thank you
And
so much, Jenny. I see that time is 5:02 now, so I know some folks might need to leave. I see that there is one question. I don't know if you want to take a few minutes to respond to that or.
sure, I appreciate the community emphasis that some of us are isolated and marginalized in our academic disciplines and departments to bring attention to Palestine and between global and local. What can be done in that case beyond research and writing? Yeah, I mean, I think this is such an important question for scholars and academics and students, right? In terms of like what, and I appreciate this about Palestine organizing and BDS organizing in particular. One of the emphasis is so much around like, what is your skill and how can you bring your skill to the work? And two things I wanted to put in the, I'm not sure I have a chat function, but workshops for Gaza is an example of the answer to this question. So like what can be done in what can be done beyond research and writing? I think one important question is like what can be done with research and writing. And so for me, like teach-ins over the past year produce honoraria that go directly to mutual aid work in Palestine, right? And so it's not only pedagogical, but it's also like material sustenance, right? Material support and care work. But what can be done beyond research and writing also is something like workshops for Gaza, where people like Layla Al-Haddad, who I talked about, is doing a cooking class, right, for workshops in Gaza, where she's doing that pedagogical work of a cooking class, but the proceeds are going to mutual aid initiatives in Gaza. And so sometimes it's about like what else can be done, and sometimes it's about like what can you do with the knowledge that you have and the skills that you bring. And I think a lot of us are doing that around researching like UC's ties, right? UC's ties to militarization, and UC ties to like death dealing industry. And what can be done beyond research and writing, sometimes that's a question of like what can be done with research. So like how can you use your research skills to indict these institutions that are complicit in what you're witnessing, right? And so I think what can be done beyond research and writing has everything to do with asking what can be done with research and writing, but also asking like what is outside of that? Like what kinds of conversations are you having in each of your worlds that are not limited to academic spaces, but that are like comprised by people who aren't forced to think about Palestine, and people who think of that space as like a retreat from having to think about the world. Like how can you force those spaces to contend with what they're trying to ignore at every kind of turn? But thank you for the question. Thank you all for your questions.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for your time, for your generosity, for giving us so much to feel in community with, to learn together, and to be moved towards acting with the responsibility of the witnessing that you have emphasized, that the people that you work with emphasize. Thank you, everyone, for your presence and contributions. We are going to conclude our webinar now.
Thank you all so much for being here and for listening and for your questions. And just know also that I'm a resource for all of you. If you need anything, you can reach out and email me, and I can share links or things that I talked about or any of the above. So thank you again. And thank you so much for
you.
It's really beautiful to meet you and talk with you.
Thank you for your time and for everything you shared, Jenny.